Sound and data.
Here we are for the Sound and Data channel on Creative Disturbance, talking to Florian Grond, who I'm mispronouncing his name already. Have to, this is the terrible part of the beginning of all these podcasts, is my mispronouncing of names. But that aside, I met Florian at the Sonification conference that was part of the Locus Sonos, and was very impressed with his work with Super Collider at that time. This is, I think it was 2010, March of 2010.
Yeah.
So 4 years ago. That was a really interesting summit in general, and a lot of interconnections were made. I ended up coming back to Marseille as part of Emira and working with Peter Sinclair, who I am hoping to have as part of the interviews of this series of podcasts. But Florian's work is very, I think the striking thing about it, and I think Thomas Hermann would be another person that I'd like to talk to about this, they're creating quite a bit of controversy in the audio display / sound art community with the insistence on replicatability, and wouldn't you say? I mean, why don't you, let's address that one first, I guess. I want to get to the stuff about perception, but
okay, well, we can start with repeatability.
Yeah.
Maybe Thomas and me. In the end, I think we agree on most things. I mean, after all, I made my thesis with him, so
yeah.
He was my supervisor.
Exactly.
I think you can think of repeatability in from two perspectives. Like, one is repeatability in more maybe scientific terms. But as soon as perception is involved, repeatability has a whole new dimension to it, so it can be repeatability in terms of repeating experiments and validating things through repeated experiments. But repeating a sound or listening to the same sound twice, that's from a phenomenological perspective, already a very, very interesting question. And I think for sonification auditory display, we should try to bring these two perspectives together. They are not the same, but we need to think them together at least. Maybe not bring them together, but think them together.
Right. And maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse here, because there's some things that you and I understand about the field that maybe the listener wouldn't have quite as clear a perspective on. So let me go to when we initially, the prelude when we were talking before I started recording. I think one of the most interesting things I got out of reading your dissertation, which for the listeners is listening mode centered sonification design for data exploration, and it's excellent, in my opinion, one of the best writings in this field of sonification. I got a lot out of David Worrell's thesis as well, but I think there's a lot of meat here. But one of the most interesting things that you brought to the table, well, maybe because I'm self-congratulating myself, I was already really engaged in using Schaeffer's 4 modes of listening as part of the way of my thinking about sonification. Then it appears in your paper much more clearly stated than any of the. I just make a reference to it in one of my papers, but you do. I think it's at about page 14 or 15 at the very introduction. You talk about the 4 direct listening modes. So I was just thinking that'd be interesting for the listener to hear your descriptions of those. So. Go ahead.
I think what we can really see in the community, and this is not only my work, is that there is an increased interest in listening modes, and that basically just brings back all the question of intentionality in perception for HCI, for human-computer interfaces, for auditory display. I think this is the larger trend that we see here. And there have been interesting contributions to listening modes, also by Paul Vickers, for instance. And also one contribution that I like very much is by Kai Turi, a Finnish scholar. And he basically looked again at all different listening modes and approaches that are out there, and tried to integrate it. And I think his integration of the listening modes are really, really interesting. Of course, we also must not forget Bill Gaver.
Yeah.
But I think what was for me the most interesting experience was to see that there is Pierre Schaeffer and there is Bill Gaver, and one is for the HCI community and the other one is for the composers.
Yes.
And yeah, I mean, I guess it's fair to say that the more complete phenomenological approach to listening is from Pierre Schaeffer.
I think so.
I mean, I think he has 4 listening modes. Bill Gaver, he has 2 listening modes, but nonetheless, I mean, Bill Gaver, he started the whole more HCI engineering, psychology-inspired approach towards auditory display.
And actually had human subjects that he tested and that sort of stuff. So there's more of a, in terms of science, the science is a little bit more substantial. But Schaeffer's approach is so much more intuitively broad, and it encompasses the places where I have a problem. And I think you sort of articulated this problem about thinking about sonification solely scientifically. You lose some aspects of the cultural richness that presents itself in the boundary between music and sonification. You know what I'm saying? So repeatability is not necessarily something that you want exactly, but if you do make something that changes over time, you want it to change in a cognitive way, in a way that the listener doesn't get bored with the repetition, but also gets information from the repetition, right? This is theoretical. I mean, this is not, I'm just sort of off the cuff.
I think, I mean, with repetition, with repetition comes the concept of the sound object. And interestingly, if you think, like, the sound object today is under lots of attack. I'm not sure that people understand today the sound object the same way that Schaeffer presented it at first.
Right.
But interestingly, the sound object was discovered by repeating fixed sounds, by repeating exactly recorded sounds. So, but it was still from Pierre Schaeffer a strictly phenomenological approach.
Right.
So Pierre Schaeffer, if I understand him correctly, he was not interested in engineering or even computer interfaces or anything. It was a strictly phenomenological approach towards listening. Yes. And so that's something that is maybe more akin to what composers do.
And I would say in terms of your work, your whole area of gestural, bringing forward the idea of time relative to the gestures of sound objects opens up a whole interesting and I think really untapped part of what is now, in my opinion, a very fixed taxonomy that doesn't include the full breadth of what sonification will become, if you know what I'm getting at here.
Yeah, I think, you mentioned the gestural aspect. The gestural aspect very much points to all these embodied dimensions of listening. Right. That's something that David Worrell also emphasizes a lot. Right. I think that Kai Turi really, in his taxonomy, really tries to tap into that. But I think what I find very interesting is that when you look, for instance, at Kai Turi's works and writings, then it's really his taxonomy. It has this phenomenological flavor to it that is similar to Pierre Schaeffer, but he informed his taxonomy really from a huge amount of neurological, psychological literature, and so on and so forth. So I think that this is really the value of his work I appreciate so much.
Yeah,
and I think what then becomes the interesting question for sonification, and what interests me, sonification as data exploration, is basically the question, like, how do we connect that to data? Because right now we spoke about sonification a lot, but sonification, it can mean many things, and I think I chose the perspective of listening intentions or listening modes because it also kind of, at first, you can then later bring in data differently, because at first it is like listening to sound, so that it becomes informative beyond just representing an object or a process.
Well, and in terms of both your research, everyone we've been talking about, maybe not Schaeffer so much, but all the other individuals, there is this great drawing that you have in the early part of the paper where you show the unimodal to multimodal dimension of sonification, which I think becomes probably the most important one of the most important dimensions of understanding any sort of clear taxonomy. I don't think that clear taxonomy actually exists yet, at least for my taste. I think there are areas that are unexplored and undefined, but that's my own. But they have to do with the fact of including multimodality, so including the visual as part of the representation. And so, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it is when we can think of multimodality in kind of two ways, and then again I have to bring in the work from Kai Turi.
Yeah.
Actually, you should interview him, I think.
Yeah, I know. He's on my list.
He's on your list. Yes.
Yeah.
He wrote this interesting paper that basically compares this kind of more cognitivist HCI paradigm of multimodality and one that is more like embodied psychology, more phenomenological approach. Because
right.
we can think of multimodality as something like where we have different kind of input channels, and to some degree, it's true that we don't see the same thing that we can hear with our ears. And then if we see and hear something at the same time, it's not the same as if we were only to listen or only to see. So okay, we have different input channels, but then how these things kind of converge after having been perceived, then you have all this kind of very interesting amodal phenomena where you can see grain, but you can also hear grain. You can also feel grain. So
right.
I think multimodality, again, we need to distinguish an approach where we talk about kind of input channels to like we must not equate the output channels of our computer with the senses.
Yeah.
So
right.
I think that's what is important to distinguish, and this is also where we have more the HCI. I mean, on the HCI always kind of tries, of course, to focus on the interface, because this is where you can control most things in the sense of a technical interface.
Right.
But we must not forget that the output channels of your computer do not necessarily match your input channels, which are your own senses. I mean, I don't even want to call them input channels, but that's often how they are thought of.
Yeah, there's a distortion because of expectations.
Yeah.
There's a thing that Oxford Sound Studies, Handbook of Sound Studies, there's a sonification chapter towards the very end of that book, and I forget the author's name right now, but they brought up a real interesting point that's to this point, which is there's a sort of urge to romanticize, which I would say is this dissonance between what you're actually hearing and what you think you're hearing, right? There's this urge to romanticize the connection of data to some sort of previous experience.
Yeah, I know of the contribution by Alexandra Super.
Yeah, that's it.
Baby Service. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I think Alexandra makes a very important point here. But then I would say, like, when I look at the example that I think Alexandra Super brings up in her contribution to this handbook, I personally would say, like, we need to distinguish when we present sonifications, then with it often just comes, like a little bit like what I would call science propaganda,
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I went into that because
but we should not equate this science propaganda with what sound can really do, because sound can carry a lot of information. The question is, like, what intentions do we have when we perceive? Like, what listening intentions do we have when we perceive the sound?
Yeah,
and then
it comes down to the question of intention. Yeah.
Overshadowed with the romanticizing gesture, then of course we actually don't get as much out of the sound as we could.
Yeah, so it's a matter of the framework and presenting the intention, so that when the attention, these are the two words that at least Roger Molina and I have been going back and forth with, attention and intention. So yeah. I mean the sonifier, or well, actually, let's just say the artist or scientist that is trying to put forward something has an intention, and their intention has to do with getting the person to pay attention to what they're trying to convey. So it's almost like art. This is where art and science really meet on some kind of level.
On some kind of level, but I would distinguish here the following. I would distinguish attention from effect.
Right.
And then actually it becomes interesting because effect and affect, and then we are again in the whole embodied domain.
Yeah.
You know.
It's funny, these words. I mean, there's another two of those words that sound very similar to each other, but the meaning they carry is so strong.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I wanted to say was basically that I personally, I think a good artist can really create. A good artist can create a situation where very generally speaking, where the audience is attentive. But the good artist also does not try to basically create it through cheap effects.
Right.
Because these are two different things. Like the effect is maybe you needed to catch someone's attention, but then you need to carry this attention for a longer stretch of time.
And to return to repetition, you have to deal with the fact that in terms of like listener attention, something that repeats too much becomes familiar, and therefore you lose information. So that's where this whole repeatability aspect of drilling down into Thomas Hermann's approach becomes problematic for me for extended listening, right? So there have to be strategies that include the ability for even the scientist, and I'm talking outside of the context of an art experience, but even the scientist is going to get fatigued by something that is absolutely repeated. So, do you have any ideas about that, or?
Yeah.
This is my own opinion.
I think. I mean, I agree with you, but I think what would be interesting to discuss with Thomas here is like. Whether this is like something that is on a perceptual level repeatable, or whether it is on a more like on a signal level repeatable. Because even if you
like signal, like Shannon signal.
Yeah, because even if you like say make sound synthesis using white noise, then that might, and you filter it a little bit, then it might be on a signal level, not be the repeatable, but on a perceptual level, it is pretty much creates a repeatable experience. So I think there are many gray zones in terms of what is repeatability. but I think Thomas, I would not be surprised like Thomas having a very, very reasonable attitude towards
this. Is by no means an attack.
Like reasonably in a sense that and that sounds like almost like a contradiction.
Some very amazing points. I mean, I really think you're strong, but just dealing with them with scientists and trying to meet that criterion, I've run into this problem about repeatability that we mentioned earlier when we were talking. So, just for their own listener experience, even though they weren't, their expectations weren't for it to be an artistic, like an entertainment or something. You still get this kind of listener fatigue problem that needs to be addressed.
I mean, we need to think of like where in which areas do we have actually successful auditory display, or I mean, like for instance, often when we speak about listening skills, like they existing in the context of medicine. Like in auscultation, and I think still in an industrial context, engine makers still listen to their engines to judge whether they work properly or not. I mean, these are all not necessarily nice and entertaining sounds.
Not at all. Anesthesiologist, I mean, I can only listen to that for a while, but if you're getting paid, so hundreds of thousands of euros a year to listen, you listen.
Exactly. So, I think that it's an interesting question. Like, how can we address, for instance, something like listener fatigue? Does that become a question of user experience, pleasantness, aesthetics? What does aesthetics mean in that context? I tried for me in this particular case I'm going a little bit into the direction of aesthetics in auditory display.
Yeah, well, that's actually a very rich area that I have a lot of interest in personally, because I came from the aesthetics across to the more scientific approach. In other words, my early work in sonification was all just about, I didn't care if I transmitted any data, I was just using the data as a driver. In the same way that, like, Cage used the I Ching as a driver, you know.
Oh yeah. But in this case, my question would be: when you did that, did you call it sonification, or what? Were you most interested in making music, or like what is the point of?
Right.
I mean, like no one has a monopoly on the word sonification, obviously, but isn't it rather an interest in making music than for instance in understanding data?
Exactly. That's exactly. I mean, I was coming in my position as a composer and performer, making sound decisions based on something that was external to my own gesture and habit, and so it was all about that, and it was very interesting. But I initially did not call it sonification. It was called sonification when it was presented, right? But that's when I started dealing with this very question that we've been sort of staying on a lot. And I arrived at, because I'm coming from an electroacoustic background and that sort of thing, I already knew about Schaeffer's writing from the 60s and I started thinking about the same thing. So it was really a great pleasure to see them arrive in your work as well. It's such an obvious interconnection. And I think also knowing some things about your own work. Well, why don't you describe some of your approach to this? Because you're on that boundary between being very empirical, representative, but also have a strong aesthetic sense that you were just referring to.
Yeah. So maybe just elaborate a little bit on the question of aesthetics, because what I found always striking was that sonification was often actually promoted in like exploratory settings, like as the title of my PhD is exploratory data analysis.
Yeah.
So basically it means that it is any exploratory setting is more descriptive in nature, and it's not normative in nature.
Right.
So you're listening to something or try to perceive something, and you try to find something new. You try to see something or perceive something or hear something that you haven't seen before. And I think in this context, it's really interesting to think about what listening intentions, what the sound object, and what aesthetics means. Because the sound object, the way I understand it, is to listen to sound without reducing the sound to something that you know already. To basically pay respect to the sound itself, you know.
Well, my reference relative to this has always been Jim Tenney's metahodos, the idea of hierarchical gestalt perception. So our brain's going to do this gestalt thing with sound, with sight, with combinations of sight, sound. And so I don't think that trivializes it, but it also complicates being able to describe what it is, what a sound object really is.
Yeah, for sure. So I think like maybe we do not necessarily believe anymore that we can listen to a sound like with pure reduced listening. I guess that is over. But we can still believe that we can navigate our intentions while we are listening.
Right.
I think this is still a very valid point. And if we actually, for exploratory data analysis or for any exploratory setting, if we want to find something new, we need to accept, or we actually need to assume that we can navigate our intentions as we perceive something. Otherwise, we would always only perceive what we know already. Right. And I think this is for me the value of reduced listening and the sound object, which in itself is of course a little bit like too transcendental for pure science and for HCI. But for everything that is more exploratory in nature, I think we can really use this notion of a sound object as something to aspire to when we listen to sound.
Well, Florian, we're at 24 minutes into the recording here, and I'm trying to keep it under a half an hour. So clearly, we've just scratched the surface. I'm just talking about the introduction to your dissertation. We did refer to some stuff about the gestural things that I'm very interested in. There's another, I don't know if you know that systematic review of mapping strategies for sonification. I think you referred to it. It's Debus and Brezin.
Yes.
But they make a really great case for all of the isolated, multi-dimensional aspects of sound, where I think the richness of sonification is as yet unexplored in terms of this kind of exploratory. Oh, I'm double using explorer, but I mean, in other words, in the context, an aesthetic context of exploration, they haven't been fully realized. And I got to say that seeing your work back in 2010 and some other pieces in that zone have kept me focused on this area of trying to map the aesthetic with the. So to conclude, what do you have to say to that sort of?
Well, I personally think that what I really take from Thomas Hermann's approach is that we need to ask ourselves if we make, very generally speaking, if we make sonifications, if we want to understand something about data. Like, I don't want to make this some sort of a discussion about what we can call sonification, what we cannot call sonification.
Yeah.
But we need to ask ourselves if we want to learn something about the data. But if we decide that we want to learn something about the data, we can still ask, and we should ask actually, like, what can be learned now from the phenomenology of listening? Like, what can be learned now from what artists actually intuitively do every day whenever they compose something or whenever they deal with sound. What there is very many things. Like, it's a very rich repertoire of terms and insights that we can use, but we need to learn to talk about it.
Yeah,
that's as usual the difficult part in sound.
It is. I mean, because people have so many sort of they have a predisposition to expect things to sound or to meet their expectations of the way things sound and meet their own cultural expectations, which readdresses this aesthetic thing. There's a lot more to talk about clearly, but I think let's just have a second one. I'll give you, like in a month or two after I've done a few more of these with some other individuals. Let's revisit this. This is an ongoing channel, and anytime if you want to,
Scott, if you want, Scott, we can continue. We can carry on, and then you just
splice it later.
Splice it the way you want.
Maybe so. Okay, let's do that. I can definitely. So let's keep going, because I think this is really interesting. And what I think is interesting about it is this strange sort of collision, right, of the different disciplines. You have I'm coming from the Cagean. I was at Mills College working with, and that's where I met Jean-François, our mutual friend, who's electroacoustic label. Jean-François Denis, what's it called? Digital imprint.
Empreinte digitale.
Empreinte digitale, yeah. And it's really a great resource for those of you listeners who might be interested in electroacoustic, the whole electroacoustic. It's probably the best in the world putting that forward. But I did work with Tudor and Cage, and my approach was this one that came from this kind of post-Cagean use of process as a means of composition. But then we arrive, but your background is exactly the other way, right? You came from science. Yeah. So what is that? Why don't you fill that in a little bit?
Well, for me, it was actually Jean-François who pointed me at the English translation of The Guide to Sound Objects. Oh, okay. And that was how I met the more phenomenological perspective onto sound. And I knew first about all the work from Bill Gaver and human-computer interaction, auditory display, and those kind of things. Okay. And so I think we see really this difference where Bill Gaver was more interested in actually using sound for a human-computer interface context, right?
Right.
Whereas a composer or an artist would not necessarily say that he's using a sound in the same way, right? Because he's not appropriating the sound or what's the proper term? Well, an artist doesn't necessarily want to operationalize sound as perception the same way as a human-computer interface researcher wants to.
Right. I mean, you don't want. Yeah.
And I think this is the kind of tension between these two approaches. But I found that when you read Gaver carefully, you find, because he does refer to Cage actually.
Yeah.
Right. So I think you find that Gaver he is very conscious about the fact that sound is actually sound always escapes you a little bit if you want to pin it down what it is.
Well, that's what
feels even more so than any visual artifact.
Right, and this is what makes these listening modes that are so well articulated by Schaeffer particularly appropriate, because you kind of bounce in and out of those. We were just talking about, that I forget the guy's name now, but the gorilla, where people don't see the gorilla walk across in the subway. There's an auditory equivalent of that where we mask out the things we don't want to intentionally perceive, which I think is a big part of what will make a very successful. I think there hasn't really been a successful sonification, frankly. Or not, other than Geiger counter, stethoscope, the gas anesthesiologist. I mean, because success would be measured by use, I would imagine. Do you have any feeling about that?
I mean, the thing is that as soon as you can measure success, you are more like in the field of like normative science, right?
Right.
Yeah. But sonification is not only that, and that's what's make it interesting, right?
Yeah.
Because sonification also wants to be descriptive, wants to be exploratory. But then you are like in the field of descriptive sciences. That's how I try to distinguish it.
Yeah.
And so that's why I suggest that we distinguish not only application areas, but really are very clear about whether sonification is for a normative purpose or for a descriptive purpose.
Yeah, and you make that quite clear in your description.
And then if we can distinguish that, we maybe understand better what we have to focus on in designing the sound.
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a dissonance here because it's like this is such a generalized term for a vast. I mean, there's the diagram on page 14, I think it is, where you break down the different hearing, and you have this chart. Here, I'll hold it up to the. We're on Skype, so he can see. This. I'm referring to that particular one that breaks down what you call the 4 direct listenings adapted from Shannon. I'm mispronouncing his name, but anyway, yeah. I think that's why I was focusing on this, because it's kind of at the crux of the fact that I think that we're trying to make one big thing into a very specific thing when it's actually many things. And
absolutely. I mean, for instance, if you just think of auditory icons,
right?
And then it's interesting if you see. I mean, it would be everyday listening in Gaver's terms, but when you look at Pierre Schaeffer, you clearly see that this is between the indexical causal and the comprehending.
Right.
So it falls already kind of
you addressed that really interestingly
between two listening intentions. So that I think that's very interesting. Like the more richer you think of listening intentions, the more difficult it will become to pin down actually and say like, now I'm in this kind of listening mode, and that means I have to design my thing that way.
Well,
but if you have a very rich taxonomy, then you really have to make design decisions, so that you have to.
Yeah. Well, and one thing that's always bothered me about at least the early world of sonification was when I had to read a 2-page pamphlet in order to hear this. In order to, like, I need a legend where the high violins represent the tidal flux, and it's just like. That should be self-evident. Now, I have a question, and I've been asking this of everybody I've been interviewing. There is this proscription against using spoken word in sonification that came in with Kramer in '97, I think, the Walker and Kramer's paper, where their definition of sonification includes, that it is the I forget exactly how they put it, but you can't use words, in other words. And that to me is like, that just always seems sort of absurd. Why can't you use words? I mean, other than the translation problem.
Okay, but I think that's also something that Thomas Hermann once told me. I think that it's more like the reason why that was put in, and this reason might be a bit more obsolete today, was mostly because from an HCI perspective, you wanted to distinguish it from dialogue systems. So you wanted to you wanted to distinguish it from say speech recognition input and text-to-speech output. Right. That was its own research area, and that's why Sonification auditory display wanted to be the rest, basically.
Everything wasn't that. Yeah, well, that makes sense, sort of. But I just think that those two disciplines should be then integrated, because I mean it would save, to me. Well, I don't know. I mean, there are different sonification designs that I think could use, text to speech or different things as cues for changing the intention of the context.
Well, you could, for instance, I'm often thinking about using text-to-speech engines, but not necessarily having them output speech.
Yeah, exactly. The speak and spell hack.
It could be actually very, very salient sonification, because our ears are so much tuned into speech.
Yeah, I think that comes up as one of the physical parameters of mapping in this breakdown in the systematic review paper.
Yeah.
Anyway, well, Florian, I'm going to back off now. I think we have plenty. This will be a fine thing for somebody to mull over, I think. But I want to revisit these things if we've had a chance to roll through this stuff. I'm very excited about what we're coming up with here at Creative Disturbance with this channel in terms of opening up a dialogue for our community of sonifying people. And if you have any suggestions to me, please email me, and listeners too, of individuals. Like I had, well, anyway, you know the story. I had forgotten about Angela's work. I'm going to definitely get a hold of her. And I forgotten. I mean, I just came to me while I was talking to you, because you brought up the thing about aesthetics, and I thought that I just was reminded of that section in her paper. Anyway, so I think
But speaking of more artistic approach, I just recently finished this work together with Mary Sherman.
Did right. Yeah, I meant to ask you to bring that up. Yeah, everyone should go. There's a beautiful Vimeo that just had this fantastic.
So there I really tried to be very strict to the data, in a sense that I didn't interpret them, but really very directly I was following paths on the surface, on the topological surface. I mean, you did all this work of surface sonification.
I did.
So
I'm working
I
now
really
with
used the
geologists in that same area, but with much more rigor, actually.
So I really used the surface and derivatives of the surface, like as sonic material, and so it was pretty close to the data. But then, of course, you make a sound arrangement that has a little bit. It's not necessarily music, but follows some aesthetic considerations. And of course, you have to start to edit the sound and arrange it, and to have some structure that is at least reminiscent of, like, say, A-B or something.
Right. That's the interesting area for me, and it's also where Thomas Herman inadvertently stepped into, like, a kind of an aesthetic swamp there, because it got very complicated. I think, at least in our little community, that was a very complicated point that kept coming up in different conversations I had. And I understand what he means, and I think you're meeting that by being replicable, but at the same time aesthetic, right? And that's what I'm trying to do when I do sonification, is I bring my music hat to the table, but I'm also want to be authentic about what I'm doing, and not just claim that, anyway, you know what I'm saying. So what was this? Do just a little description. There are these very the paintings are almost sculptural, in they have depth, right, with the amount of materials that she uses, right?
Exactly. So Mary's paintings have a lot of structure on the surface, and Mary got a scan of several sections of this surface, and then she gave this data to me, and then I created sonifications of this surface data, and so that then the way how I organized the sonic material in time, it was more like an artistic decision. But the original sound material was really, I can say, a sonification.
So was it
exploring different parameter settings, obviously, but very close to the data. And then also maybe another aesthetic dimension in the work was to basically display the sound over foam core panels with transducers in space that would aesthetically kind of be reminiscent of the painting in terms of the dimension, so that you have some sort of an empty canvas that where the sound comes out. So you have different layers and levels where you can make aesthetic decisions. But
and I'll include the Vimeo link as part of the text that accompanies this podcast.
That would be great.
So the listeners can see, because it is kind of hard to describe, but the Vimeo makes it very clear what's going on. Really interesting work, and for my aesthetic, this is one kind of my zone of stuff that I like. So anyway, this is the reason why I'm living in Dallas, Texas now, and I still have a house in Oakland, and this position at ATEC has afforded me the ability to really dig in on this stuff. So I really appreciate getting your feedback about this stuff, and but I think I am gonna definitely. Now this is it. I'm gonna stop because it is Friday, and all that. So, but I really appreciate your time, Florian.
Sound and beta.